She built an empire with her bare hands. They destroyed her in 30 seconds with a smile. One saleswoman. One sentence whispered loud enough for the entire showroom to hear. And Elena Vale, the woman who clawed her way from nothing to the cover of every major fashion magazine, stood there in a room full of chandeliers and cold eyes, feeling exactly like the 19-year-old girl everyone once told to give up. Then the doors opened, and every person in that boutique suddenly remembered they had made a catastrophic mistake. Drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit like, stay until the end, because what happens next will change everything you think you know about power, love, and what a man will burn down for the woman he loves. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday. It came in a cream-colored envelope so thick it felt almost obscene between Elena's fingers, the kind of paper that cost more per sheet than most people spent on lunch. The wax seal pressed into the back bore the initials M.B., Maison Blanche, in a script so refined it looked like the letters had been individually placed by someone who had never once rushed anything in their life. Elena turned it over twice before opening it. She was standing in the middle of her own studio on the 14th floor of a building she had leased with money she earned, surrounded by half-finished sketches and bolts of fabric, and the soft hum of 3 industrial sewing machines running simultaneously in the back room. Her assistant, Jade, had set the envelope on top of her coffee without saying a word, which was unusual because Jade had opinions about everything and expressed all of them constantly. "You're not going to say anything?" Elena asked without looking up. "I'm waiting for you to breathe first," Jade said. Elena hadn't realized she'd stopped. Maison Blanche was not simply a boutique. Calling it a boutique was like calling a cathedral a building. Technically accurate, spiritually insulting. It had existed in this city for 61 years. It addressed 4 generations of the wealthiest brides in the country. Its waiting list ran 18 months long, and that was just to schedule a consultation. Fashion editors who had spent decades in the industry still spoke about their first visit to Maison Blanche in the hushed, careful way people describe things they were afraid to fully examine because the memory was too important to risk getting wrong. Elena had first heard about it when she was 19, from a woman in a fabric shop who mentioned it the way you mention something that exists on another planet, with admiration but without any real expectation of arrival. She was 31 now. The invitation said her name in handwritten ink, Ms. Elena Vale, Creative Director, Vale House. She read it 4 times to make sure she hadn't invented it. "We're going," she told Jade. Jade exhaled. "Obviously we're going. I already cleared your Thursday." Thursday arrived cold and overcast, the kind of morning where the city looked like it was trying to compose itself after a difficult night. Elena dressed carefully. Not because she was nervous, she told herself, but because she understood that fashion was a language and she intended to speak it fluently. She wore a charcoal-wrapped dress she had designed herself, cut to move with her body rather than apologize for it. Her jewelry was minimal. Her heels added 3 inches she didn't need, but wanted. Jade arrived 14 minutes early, wearing an expression of barely contained energy that she managed to compress into something approaching professional calm. They took a car. Elena watched the city slide past the window and did not say much. Maison Blanche occupied the ground floor of a limestone building on a street so quiet and expensive that even the traffic seemed to understand it was supposed to behave itself. The window displays were immaculate, single gowns suspended in each frame as though gravity had decided to cooperate with the aesthetic. No price tags, no promotional signage, nothing that suggested the place had any interest in explaining itself to anyone. Elena pushed the door open herself. The interior was everything the exterior promised, and then some. White marble floors. Chandeliers that threw light like they'd been installed by someone who understood that the right illumination could make a woman feel like she was walking through her own best moment. Gowns arranged along the walls in a spectrum that moved from ivory to champagne to the faintest blush, each one protected by space, by silence, by the particular reverence that expensive things demand from the rooms they inhabit. There were 4 other customers visible, 2 women being attended by staff near the far wall, one seated in a velvet chair studying a lookbook, one standing before a floor-length mirror while a seamstress moved around her with pins. All of them stopped, in their own way, when Elena and Jade walked in. Not dramatically, not obviously. Just that barely perceptible pause that happens when something enters a room that doesn't quite match what the room expected. Elena felt it the way she always felt it, a pressure at the back of the throat, a slight shift in the air. She ignored it the way she always ignored it. Practice had made the motion automatic. A saleswoman materialized from somewhere near the reception desk, tall, precisely groomed, wearing the particular expression of someone who had spent years cultivating the ability to assess a situation within the first 4 seconds of observing it. Her name tag read Sylvie. She approached Elena with a smile that had been constructed rather than grown. "Welcome to Maison Blanche," Sylvie said. "Are you here to browse or do you have an appointment?" "I have an invitation," Elena said, and produced the envelope. Sylvie took it, looked at it. Something moved behind her eyes, fast, almost imperceptible. But Elena had spent too many years in rooms like this not to recognize the calculation happening in real time. "Of course," Sylvie said. "Ms. Vale." She handed the envelope back. "If you'll follow me, I can show you through our current collection." What followed was 12 minutes of the most exquisitely delivered condescension Elena had experienced in years. Sylvie led them through the main showroom without stopping at anything significant, moving at a pace that communicated she was conducting a tour rather than a consultation. When Elena paused in front of a gown, deep ivory, structured bodice, a skirt that fell in controlled waves, and reached out to examine the construction near the waist seam, Sylvie spoke before Elena's fingers made contact. "That particular piece runs in a very limited size range," Sylvie said. "We found it's quite specific in terms of who it flatters." Elena withdrew her hand slowly. "I'm familiar with the construction," she said. "I designed something similar 2 seasons ago." Sylvie smiled. It did not reach anything above her cheekbones. They kept moving. Jade had gone quiet beside her, which meant Jade was furious, which meant Elena needed to remain composed for both of them. The math of that was familiar too. She had done it in showrooms, in pitch meetings, in industry panels where she was the only person in the room who looked like her. She knew how to breathe evenly. She knew how to keep her jaw relaxed and her shoulders level and her voice neutral even when something in her chest was doing something that felt like being squeezed. They had reached the rear of the showroom, a section separated from the main floor by a partial wall, less dramatically lit, housing styles that were competent but clearly positioned as the secondary collection. When Sylvie stopped and gestured with an open palm, "This section might be more appropriate for someone of your silhouette," she said. The pause before silhouette was half a second long, maybe less, but it was engineered and everyone within earshot heard it, and the woman in the velvet chair looked up from her lookbook, and the seamstress near the mirror slowed her movements, and the silence that followed was the loudest Elena had heard in a very long time. Jade made a sound. Elena put her hand on Jade's arm without looking at her. "Thank you," Elena said, in a voice that was very quiet and very even and cost her something she would not think about until later. "I think we've seen enough." She turned. She walked toward the exit at a pace that communicated nothing. Her heels clicked against the marble in a rhythm that did not break. She did not look at anyone. She did not allow her expression to shift until she was certain no one in that room could see her face. They were almost at the door. It opened from the outside. Damien Voss was not a large man in the way people expected power to look. He was not someone you noticed from across the room because of his physical presence, the way you might notice a professional athlete or a man who had spent his life trying to appear threatening. He was medium height, lean, dressed in a dark coat that was neither expensive-looking nor cheap, but simply correct in the way things worn by certain men are simply correct. His hair was dark. His face was composed in a way that had nothing to do with effort. It was a face that had learned, somewhere along the way, that showing nothing was more effective than showing anything. He was 44 years old. He had been running one of the most quietly influential criminal operations this city had ever produced since he was 31. He had never once appeared in a newspaper by choice. He had never attended a public function where he was not the least conspicuous person in the room. His name was known by judges, mayors, federal investigators, and the heads of 3 competing organizations, all of whom had learned, through various expensive lessons, that the most effective response to Damien Voss was to pretend, at all times, that he did not exist. He stepped into Maison Blanche and held the door open for the woman who was walking out. Elena did not see him for half a second because she was looking at the floor, at the marble, at the space between her feet and the exit that she needed to cross without losing anything else today. Then she looked up, and her husband was there. and his face changed in the way it only changed for her. A slight softening around the eyes, almost invisible, the kind of thing you would miss if you didn't know exactly where to look. "Hey," she said. "Hey." He studied her face for 2 seconds. "You ready?" "Yes," she said. "Let's go." She moved past him toward the car. He held the door, then didn't follow immediately. He stood in the threshold for a moment, not blocking it, not performing anything, simply present, and looked back into the showroom. Sylvie had not moved from the rear section, but she was watching. Everyone was watching. The woman with the lookbook, the seamstress, the 2 customers near the far wall. They had all realized, with that specific horror that belongs to people who have made a mistake in front of someone they should not have made a mistake in front of, exactly who had just walked through their door. Damien did not raise his voice. He looked at Sylvie across the length of the showroom, and when he had her full attention, he asked one question. "Who owns this store?" That was all. He let the door close behind him. In the car, Elena sat beside him and watched the city pass in the opposite direction and did not speak for a long time. Damien did not push. He had learned over 9 years of marriage that Elena processed things in layers, that the first layer was always the one she showed the world, controlled and upright, and that beneath it were other layers that needed time and quiet before they were willing to surface. He knew how to give her that. It was one of the things she had never expected from him. "It was nothing," she said finally. "Okay," he said. "I've dealt with worse." "I know you have." She turned to look at him. His eyes were on the window. His jaw was doing something tight and controlled that she recognized. "Damien, I'm fine." "You're not fine." "I said I'm fine, Elena." She watched him for a moment. "Don't do anything." He didn't answer. "I mean it. I walked out with my dignity intact. That's the win. Don't take that from me." He was quiet for so long she thought he wasn't going to say anything. Then, "You're the only person in my life who uses the word win like that. And it makes me feel like I'm losing something I don't know how to name." She reached over and put her hand on top of his. He turned his hand over and held hers. They rode the rest of the way in silence, and it was the kind of silence that meant something different than the silence in the showroom. It was the weight of 2 people who understood each other in ways that didn't always need language. That night, she lay awake beside him long after she heard his breathing even out. The ceiling was dark. The room was quiet. Outside, the city made its distant sounds. Traffic, wind, the occasional fragment of someone else's life passing by. She stared at the ceiling and replayed the moment Sylvie had gestured toward the back section, and the way the word silhouette had sat in the air between them like something physical. It wasn't the worst thing anyone had ever said to her. Not close to the worst. That was what made it so devastating. Because she was 31 years old. She had built a fashion house from nothing, from a single room with 1 sewing machine and a loan she'd spent 4 years paying back. She had been featured in 6 national publications in the past 2 years. She had dressed women who moved through the world at levels she once couldn't have imagined accessing. She had done all of it while people told her, explicitly and implicitly and in the space between words, that her body was a problem that needed to be managed before she could be taken seriously. She had genuinely, foolishly thought, that the Maison Blanc invitation meant that time was over. She pressed her hand flat against the mattress beside her husband's sleeping shoulder and told herself very firmly that she was not going to cry about this. She had cried about things like this when she was 22 and 25 and 28. She was not doing it at 31. She was not. She lasted about 4 more minutes. By morning, she had stopped. By morning, she was already thinking about what came next. Not about Maison Blanc, not about Sylvie, but about the fact that something needed to change, and she was the only person she fully trusted to change it. She did not know yet that by morning, the world would already know what had happened. She did not know that someone in that showroom had been filming on a phone, had uploaded it before Elena's car had traveled 6 blocks, and that the clip was already moving through the internet with the particular velocity reserved for moments that touched something people didn't know they needed to see touched. She did not know that by 7 in the morning, 34,000 people would know her name. She did not know that by 7 in the morning, 4 of them would know her husband's name too, and would have begun making calls that would reach desks in places Damien had spent 13 years keeping his name away from. She was asleep when her phone started ringing. She was dreaming about fabric, about the weight of silk in her hands, about a room full of light where no one was watching her to decide if she belonged. The ringing pulled her up through the dream, and she reached for the phone without opening her eyes, and Jade's voice came through before Elena was fully awake. "You need to look at your phone," Jade said. Her voice had a quality Elena hadn't heard from her before. Not panic, not excitement, but something that lived in the space between the two. "You need to look at it right now, and then you need to call me back because I don't know whether to be terrified or start making coffee." Elena sat up. Beside her, Damien was already awake. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, looking at his own phone, and his face had done something it almost never did. It had gone completely, utterly still. "Damien," she said. He didn't look at her immediately. When he did, there was something in his expression she hadn't seen before. Or rather, she had seen it before, but never directed at something that involved her. It was the look of a man who had just understood the full architecture of a situation and was already 3 moves into calculating the response. "How many people know your name?" he asked. "What?" He turned the phone toward her. The number on the screen was not 34,000 anymore. It was climbing past 200,000 and moving like it had somewhere urgent to be, and beneath her name, beneath her face captured in that showroom with her back straight and her expression controlled, was another name in bold text, and that name was his, and beside it were 2 words that the entire city had spent 13 years pretending not to say out loud. Mafia King. Elena stared at the screen for a long time. Then she said very quietly, "What did you do?" And Damien looked at her, and for the first time in 9 years of marriage, she could not read what was behind his eyes. "Nothing yet," he said. Yet was the word that kept her awake for the rest of the morning. The word yet lived in the apartment with them for the rest of that morning, like a third person who hadn't been invited and refused to leave. Elena sat at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold in front of her and her phone face down beside it. She had stopped looking at the screen 40 minutes ago because every time she picked it up, the number was larger and the headlines were worse, and the comments underneath, thousands of them, then tens of thousands, were doing what comment sections always did, which was take something that belonged to her and her alone and spread it across surfaces she had no control over. Damien was on the phone in the next room. He had been on the phone, she realized, since before she'd gotten out of bed. She could hear him through the wall, but not the words. Just the particular cadence of his voice when he was managing something, low and measured and utterly without inflection. She had heard that voice during late nights and early mornings for 9 years. She knew exactly what it meant. It meant decisions were being made and she was not part of them. She got up and pushed the kitchen door open without knocking. He was standing at the window with his back to her, one hand in his pocket, the other holding the phone to his ear. He heard the door and turned and met her eyes and held up one finger. She stayed in the doorway and waited. "No," he said into the phone. Then, "That's not what I asked?" Then, "I'll call you back." He ended the call and lowered the phone and looked at her with an expression that was working very hard at neutral. "Who was that?" she asked. "Marcus." Marcus was his lawyer, his oldest lawyer, the one who had been with him since before Elena, which meant the one who handled the things that the newer lawyers weren't cleared to handle. Elena had met Marcus 6 times in 9 years. Every single time, something significant had already happened. "Why is Marcus involved?" she said. "He's monitoring the situation." "What situation, Damien? Our situation or your situation?" Something shifted in his jaw, barely. "They're the same situation." "They're really not," she said. "My situation is that I got humiliated in a boutique and somebody filmed it. Your situation is—" She stopped, pressed her fingers against the countertop, started again. "Your name is on the internet next to the word Mafia. That is not my situation. I'm aware of what's on the internet. Are you aware that my publicist has called me 7 times this morning? That 3 brands I work with have emailed asking for statements? That Jade is sitting in my studio right now trying to figure out whether to cancel my appearances next week? Tell Jade to cancel nothing. Damien, Elena." His voice didn't rise. It never rose. That was one of the things about him she had spent years trying to decide whether she loved or found frightening. "Nothing you have built is going to collapse because of one morning of bad headlines. I need you to trust me on that. She looked at him across the kitchen. The light coming through the window was the pale gray of an overcast morning, and it did nothing flattering to either of them. They were just two people standing in a kitchen in yesterday's exhaustion, and she could see clearly the gap between what he was saying and what he was not saying. "I trust you," she said. "I don't trust what you're about to do." He was quiet. "Don't buy it," she said. He looked at her. "Whatever you're thinking," she said, "whatever Marcus is helping you figure out, don't buy it. Don't send anyone there. Don't do anything that makes this about you instead of about me. Please." He held her gaze for a long moment. His hand was still in his pocket. His phone was still in the other hand, and she could see from where she stood that the screen had lit up with another incoming call that he was not answering. "Go to your studio," he said finally. "Talk to Jade. Handle your press however you want to handle it. I'll stay out of it." "I need to hear you say it." "I just said it." "Damien." "Elena, I said I'll stay out of it." The first thread of something almost sharp entered his voice, so brief she might have missed it if she hadn't been watching for it. "Let me handle my end and you handle yours. That's how we work." She studied him for another 3 seconds. Then she picked up her bag from the counter, her jacket from the hook by the door, and left. She didn't slam anything. She didn't need to. The studio felt like the only stable surface in a morning that kept tilting. Elena walked in and Jade handed her a fresh coffee without speaking, which was its own kind of mercy, and Elena stood in the center of the room between the cutting tables and the dress forms, and breathed in the smell of fabric and chalk and industrial thread, and felt, incrementally, like herself again. "How bad?" Elena asked. "Scale of 1 to 10? Just tell me." Jade held up her tablet. The clip was everywhere. Not just social media, but 3 major news sites, 2 fashion blogs with significant readerships, and 1 entertainment news outlet that had managed to already produce a 4-minute segment complete with graphics and a chyron that read, "Mafia boss wife humiliated at elite boutique." The segment had been viewed as of 6 minutes ago 900,000 times. "The comments are actually mostly on your side," Jade said. "The public sympathy angle is, I don't want public sympathy. I know. I didn't go there to become a sympathy story." "I know, Elena. I went there because I earned that invitation, and I had every right to be in that room. I know." Jade set the tablet down. "And everyone watching that clip can see exactly that. They can see you standing there. They can see your face. And they can see—" She paused. "They can see him walking in." The room was quiet for a moment. "The piece about Damien is what's growing," Jade said, more carefully now. "The fashion story is, people are angry, they're sharing it, they're tagging brands and using it as a conversation about the industry, which is actually, objectively, an important conversation. But the Damien angle is the one that's metastasizing. Every outlet wants the Mafia King's wife framing because it's more dramatic. Then we redirect," Elena said. "Every interview, every statement, every response I give is about the industry, about size discrimination, about what it costs women to walk into spaces that were built to make them feel like they don't belong. We do not comment on Damien. We do not acknowledge that angle. We make this story about what it was actually about." Jade was quiet for a second. "That only works if Damien doesn't do something that makes his angle unavoidable." Elena looked at her. "I'm just saying," Jade said. "He said he'd stay out of it." Jade's face did something diplomatic. "Jade?" "I believe he said it," Jade said carefully. "I just think the definition of staying out of it might be slightly different for a man like, don't. Okay? He said he'd stay out of it." "Okay, Elena." They looked at each other. Then Elena turned toward her design table and picked up a pencil and stared at the half-finished sketch pinned to the board in front of her, a structured bodice she'd been working on for 6 weeks, and tried to make her brain do what it normally did in this room, which was narrow itself down to line and proportion and the problem of how fabric moved across the body in real space versus how it looked on paper. She managed about 4 minutes before Jade's phone buzzed and Jade made a small sound and held the screen toward her, and Elena read the headline and closed her eyes. "Voss Family Investment Group acquires Maison Blanc in overnight deal." She called him from the stairwell because she needed to be somewhere without witnesses. He answered on the second ring. "You said you'd stay out of it," she said. She heard how her voice sounded and didn't bother correcting it. I didn't touch anything you were going to touch, he said. Damien, I didn't interfere with your press. I didn't contact your publicist. I didn't call anyone in the industry. I stayed completely out of your side of this. You bought the store. I bought a building. Are you? She stopped, started again. Are you actually doing this right now? Are you standing somewhere comfortable explaining to me that what you did was fine because of how you're choosing to define it? I'm telling you what I did and what I didn't do. You bought the store that humiliated me. Do you understand what that looks like? Do you understand what people are going to say now? That the only reason I'm even standing in fashion is because my husband buys buildings when someone hurts my feelings? Silence on his end. Not empty silence. The kind that had weight. That is not what happened, he said. That's exactly what happened. That's the only story anyone is going to tell now. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she hated it and pushed past it. I spent 12 years, Damien. 12 years building something that was mine, that nobody could take credit for. Not my family, not investors, not luck, not some man with a checkbook who decided to intervene. Mine. And in one morning, you handed every person who ever doubted me the easiest explanation they've ever had. The stairwell was cold. Her hand holding the phone was trembling slightly, which she registered and noted and chose not to think about. Elena. His voice was quieter now. Not softer, or quieter, which was different. Nobody in this industry is going to look at what you've built and think it came from me. Anyone who knows your work, it doesn't matter what anyone who knows my work thinks. It matters what everyone else thinks. It matters what the headline says. And the headline doesn't say, Designer Elena Vale responds to discrimination with vision and resilience. The headline says, Mafia boss buys boutique that insulted wife. Another silence. This one longer. Tell me what you want me to do, he said. I want you to have not done it. That's not a choice I have anymore. No, she said. It's not. She pressed her back against the cold wall of the stairwell and stared at the concrete ceiling. So now I have to figure out what to do with a boutique I didn't ask for in a city that is watching every move I make. And I have to figure out how to do it in a way that doesn't look like I'm either your puppet or your trophy. And I have to do that while my phone won't stop ringing, and my husband is apparently being described in international news as, she laughed, but it had no warmth in it at all. Quote, a ghost who bought a building to defend his wife's honor. That part's not inaccurate, he said. Damien, I'm not apologizing for protecting you. I'm not asking you to apologize for protecting me. I'm asking you to understand that the way you protect me keeps removing the ground I'm standing on. She pulled a breath. You eliminate the threat, and I'm left with no ground, every single time. He didn't say anything for long enough that she thought the call might have dropped. Then, I hear you. Do you? Yes. What does hearing me mean? What does it actually mean for what you do next? He was quiet again. The stairwell hummed with the distant sound of the building doing its work. Ventilation, plumbing, the hum of lives happening on other floors. I don't know yet, he said, and she was surprised enough by the honesty of it that she didn't respond immediately. Okay, she said finally. Okay. She pushed off the wall, straightened, moved the emotion in her chest somewhere manageable. I have an idea. For the building. But I need you to let it be mine. Completely mine. I need your name on absolutely nothing visible. Done. And I need you to understand that if you override me on this, if you make one single decision about that building without asking me first, we have a problem that I don't know how to walk back from. The pause this time was different. Not resistant, almost careful. I understand, he said. She ended the call and stood in the stairwell for another 30 seconds with her eyes closed, breathing the cold air, letting her pulse settle from something ragged back towards something she could work with. Then she went back upstairs and told Jade to clear her afternoon, and she got a legal pad, and she started drawing the future of a building she hadn't wanted and didn't plan to waste. The idea took shape over 48 hours, with the specific intensity of things that have been waiting inside a person long enough that once released, they arrive already formed. Elena didn't sleep much. She drew constantly. Not gowns, not collections, but floor plans, sight lines, the movement of people through a space, and the way that movement either opened people up or closed them down depending on how the room was arranged. Jade watched it all with the expression of someone witnessing something she'd seen building for years without knowing what it was going to become. "You're reinventing the whole thing," Jade said on the second morning, looking at the sheets spread across the design table. "The original thing never should have existed the way it existed," Elena said. 61 years of telling women they're welcome only if they meet certain requirements. 61 years of back sections and diplomatic insults dressed up in polished smiles. She looked at the floor plan. "I want it to feel different the second you walk in. Not just look different, feel different. The lighting, the layout, the way the staff is trained, the size range of every single piece on the floor, all of it is changing." Come on, that's a complete rebuild. Yes, that's going to cost. I know what it's going to cost. And Damien is funding it quietly with no creative involvement, no naming rights, and no opinions about the budget. Elena looked up. His accountants will see the numbers. His name will appear on no document that will ever be visible to the public. If anyone asks who financed it, the answer is a private investment group, which is technically true. Jade was quiet for a moment. "Does he know that's the arrangement?" "We discussed it." "That's not what I asked." Elena looked at her steadily. "He knows." He knew most of it. What he didn't know, what Elena had chosen not to tell him yet because she hadn't fully processed what it meant, was that the call from his father had come in while she was drawing floor plans at 2 a.m, and that she had been awake and had heard Damien step out to take it, and that she had not meant to listen, but the apartment was very quiet, and Damien had left the bedroom door not quite fully closed. She had heard 3 things clearly. His father's voice, low and controlled through the phone speaker, saying, "You showed them your chest." Damien saying, "I know." His father again, "There is no walking that back. They know now. They will always know." And Damien, after a long pause, "I'm aware of the risk." And then his father, "The risk isn't yours. The risk is hers. Because they won't come at you directly. Not anymore. They'll come at the thing you couldn't stop yourself from protecting. Do you understand what I'm telling you?" And Damien, very quietly, "Yes." Elena had lain in the dark after that, staring at the ceiling, listening to her husband come back to bed and lie down and stare at the ceiling too, and neither of them had said anything, and she had not told him what she'd heard, and she was not sure why. Maybe because she wasn't ready for the conversation, maybe because some part of her needed another few hours of believing that the boutique project was simply what it appeared to be. Her vision, her rebuild, her answer to a moment of humiliation. His father's words had made it something else. "They'll come at the thing you couldn't stop yourself from protecting." She was the thing. She had always been the thing, she understood now, and she had known it in an abstract sense for years. Had understood that being married to a man like Damien came with categories of risk that most wives would never encounter. But she had kept that knowledge compartmentalized, in its own room, behind a door she didn't open too often. His father's voice had opened the door. She was still thinking about it 3 days later when the first renovation crew arrived at Maison Blanc, and she went to oversee the initial walkthrough. The building was empty, cleared of the previous inventory as part of the acquisition agreement, and walking through it without the gowns and the chandeliers and the particular atmosphere of cultivated exclusivity was disorienting. It was just a building. Marble floors, high ceilings, rooms that had been designed to make certain people feel welcome and others feel watched. She walked through every room. She took photographs. She stood in the rear section, the section Sylvie had guided her toward with that engineered half-second pause, and looked at the space and thought about what it had been used for and what it was going to become. The project manager, a compact woman named Rosa, who came recommended through 3 separate channels and whose contract specified nothing about the ownership of the building, found Elena in the back section and waited for her to finish whatever she was thinking. "This wall comes down," Elena said, pointing at the partial partition that separated the rear from the main floor. "The whole thing. I want the space to flow directly into the front. No divisions, nothing that suggests there's a hierarchy to where you're allowed to stand." Rosa made a note. "And I want the lighting reconfigured throughout. The current system is designed to spotlight the product. I want it designed to flatter the person, every person, regardless of size or coloring or age." "That's a full rewire," Rosa said. "Yes. Timeline gets longer." "I know. Budget gets umped." "I know." Elena turned to face her. Can it be done in 6 weeks? Rosa looked at the ceiling, at the walls, at the scope of the calculation she was running in her head. 5 weeks if we go 7 days, and I bring in 2 crews. Do it. She was on her way back through the main floor toward the entrance when she noticed the door to the storage room in the far corner was not flush with its frame. Not open, just not quite right. She stopped, looked at it. It was probably nothing, a warped frame, an old building settling. Rosa had moved ahead toward the front and was on her phone. Elena pushed the storage room door open. It was dark inside. She found the light switch on the wall, a bare industrial bulb that threw flat shadows, and looked at the room. Metal shelving units running along 3 walls, cardboard boxes, some labeled, some not, a stack of rolled blueprints in a corner, old inventory materials, the kind of room that accumulates everything an established business doesn't want to deal with and never quite gets around to clearing out. On the bottom shelf, behind 2 cardboard boxes she moved without thinking because they were in her way, was a metal document box with a combination lock that had not been locked. The clasp was open, the lid slightly raised, as if someone had been in it recently and hadn't quite finished what they were doing. She should have called Rosa. She should have walked away and made a note and dealt with it later through appropriate channels. Instead, she opened it. The documents inside were not inventory records. They were not boutique-related in any identifiable way. They were financial records, dense, detailed, the kind of thing that took training to fully read. And they were old. Some of them dated 15 and 16 years back, and they bore the letterhead of a holding company whose name Elena did not recognize. But she recognized 2 other things. She recognized the address at the top of several pages because it was the address of this building, written again and again across different document dates spanning nearly a decade. And she recognized the signature on the bottom of 3 of the older pages because she had seen it before. On their marriage certificate, on the deed to their apartment, on the document she had signed when they formalized the financing for her studio 5 years ago. It was not Damien's signature. It was his father's. She stood in the storage room under the flat industrial light and looked at the documents in her hands and felt the specific, particular cold that moves through a person, not when they discover something terrible, but when they discover that something they believed was random was not random at all. That what they walked into was already there, waiting, long before they arrived. She thought about the invitation, the cream-colored envelope, the handwritten ink. She thought about his father's voice through the barely open door. They'll come at the thing you couldn't stop yourself from protecting. Her hands were very steady. She was surprised by that. She had expected them to shake. She put the documents back in the box exactly as she had found them, closed the lid, replaced the cardboard boxes in front of it, turned off the light, and pulled the storage room door back to its original, not quite flush position. Then she walked out of the building into the gray afternoon, told Rosa she'd be in touch tomorrow, got into her car, and sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine for a very long time. Damien had known this building. His family had used this building, before the invitation, before the humiliation, before the purchase that he had framed as impulse, as a husband's rage made into transaction. He had known. She thought about the 9 years, the late nights, the conversations she had assumed were complete because she hadn't known what questions she was missing. She thought about the way he said, "I hear you," that day in the stairwell, the careful, specific honesty of, "I don't know yet." And she tried to measure the distance between the man who had said those things and the man whose family's financial records were sitting in the storage room of a building he'd allegedly bought on impulse. She started the car. She did not drive home. She drove to the studio, and she sat across from Jade, and she told her everything, the documents, the signature, the dates. And when she finished, the studio was very quiet. Jade looked at her for a long moment. "What are you going to do?" Elena looked at the floor plan spread on the table between them. Her vision for the building, 5 weeks of work, the lighting that would flatter every person who stood beneath it, the wall that was coming down. "I'm going to ask him," she said. "And if he already knew?" Elena picked up her pencil, set it back down. "Then everything changes," she said. Everything. She drove home at 8 o'clock. The apartment was lit from the inside, and through the window she could see Damien at the kitchen table with papers in front of him, doing the same thing he was always doing in the hours after most people had stopped working. She rode the elevator up, She put her key in the door. She walked into the kitchen and he looked up from his papers, and she looked at him. At this man she had chosen 9 years ago, who was imperfect in ways she had catalogued and accepted, and sometimes loved and sometimes resented, who had spent their entire marriage trying to protect her in ways that had costs she was only now beginning to fully calculate. "I need to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to understand that your answer is going to determine something important." He put down his pen. He looked at her with full attention, not performed attention, the real kind. The kind she had fallen in love with years ago because it was rarer than anything money could produce. "Ask," he said. She sat down across from him. "Did you already know that building?" she said. "Before any of this, before the invitation, before I walked through that door, did your family already have a connection to Maison Blanc?" The silence that followed was exactly 4 seconds long. She counted them. And in the 4th second, before he said a single word, she had her answer. Not because he looked guilty, not because he looked away, but because he looked at her with an expression of absolute unguarded recognition. The look of a man who has been waiting, without knowing he was waiting, for a door to finally open. "Yes," he said. One word. One word, and the ground shifted under everything. One word. And the kitchen, which had always been the warmest room in their apartment, the one with the good light, and the window that faced east, and the particular smell of coffee that had accumulated in the walls over 9 years of mornings, became somewhere else entirely. Elena sat very still. She had prepared herself in the car on the way home for 2 possible responses. She had run them both through her head with the methodical precision she applied to everything she didn't want to approach emotionally. The first possibility was denial. "No, what are you talking about? I bought that building because of what happened to you." The second was a complicated kind of deflection, the particular architecture of a man who knew how to redirect a conversation so smoothly you didn't notice the movement until you were already somewhere new. She had prepared responses to both. She had organized her thoughts. She had decided in the elevator that she was not going to cry, and she was not going to shout, and she was going to stay in the register of someone conducting an inquiry rather than someone whose foundation had just shifted. She had not prepared for yes. For the simple, undecorated fact of it, 1 syllable and no attempt to surround it with anything softer. "How long?" she asked. Damien set his pen down on top of the papers in front of him, and she noticed that his hands were steady. Not the steadiness of someone who felt nothing, but the steadiness of someone who had known this was coming and had decided at some point before she walked through the door that he was done running from it. 15 years, he said. "My father used that location for meetings before the current ownership. Neutral ground, not affiliated directly with any of our operations. That was the point. A legitimate business in a legitimate neighborhood. No one looked twice at men in expensive suits walking into a bridal boutique." Elena listened. Her jaw was not tight, her breathing was even. She was performing a stillness she did not feel with a skill she had developed in showrooms and pitch meetings and every moment in her adult life when the ground moved and she had to pretend she was standing on solid earth. "And the invitation," she said. He looked at her steadily. "The invitation," she repeated. "The cream envelope with the handwritten ink. Who sent it?" "The ownership of the boutique was in transition," he said. "We, my family's holding group, had maintained a quiet relationship with the building for years. When the senior partner retired and his daughter took over primary operations, she reached out to update certain arrangements. I was informed of the transition. I had no reason to— Damien!" Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. "Who sent me the invitation?" A breath, not a long one, but she saw it. "It came through the new director's office," he said. "At my father's suggestion." The room was absolutely silent for a moment. "Your father suggested that the boutique send me an invitation," Elena said. "He believed it would be a meaningful opportunity for you. Given your work, your reputation, the timing made sense. Maison Blanc had real cultural weight in the industry, and you had—" "Stop!" She put her hand flat on the table. Not hard, just flat. A period. "Stop explaining the logic. I'm not asking about the logic. I'm asking whether you knew, before I walked into that building, that your family had a connection to it." The 4 seconds of silence she'd counted before his yes felt different now. Shorter, almost, in retrospect. This silence was longer. This one cost him something visible. I knew my family had a historical connection to the property, he said carefully. I did not know. He stopped. Restructured. I did not anticipate that the staff would respond to you the way they did. But you knew where I was going. Yes. And you knew who owned the building when you bought it on impulse. His jaw tightened, fractionally. You already had the infrastructure to acquire it, she said. That's why it happened overnight. It wasn't impulse. It was a transaction you could execute in hours because the groundwork was already there. He didn't confirm it. He didn't deny it. He looked at her across the table with an expression that was the most honest she had seen from him in weeks. And the honesty of it was exactly the problem, because it contained everything: confirmation and regret, and the particular look of a man who had made calculated decisions about someone else's life with the genuine belief that he was doing right by her. Elena pushed her chair back and stood up. She didn't go anywhere immediately. She stood beside the table and looked at the window and the city lights beyond it, which had the decency to keep existing normally while everything else shifted. The humiliation, she said. The woman who guided me to the back section. Was that? She could not quite finish the sentence initially, and she hated that, and she pushed through it. Was that something your family arranged? No. Fast. Certain. No, Elena, that was not. We would never. For the first time, his voice carried something close to heat. That woman acted on her own. I need you to believe that. Whatever else I've told you tonight, I need you to understand that what happened to you in that room was not something anyone in my family engineered. The invitation was genuine. The humiliation was not anticipated. I was not. He stopped. His hands, still flat on the table, pressed down slightly harder. I was not watching you be humiliated from some position of control. I walked in because I was supposed to meet you for lunch and you weren't responding to your phone, and I had no idea what I was walking into. She turned to look at him. His face, in this moment, was doing something she didn't see often. It was open in a way that was almost uncomfortable to witness. Not vulnerable in the performed sense, not the vulnerability of a man who had decided to deploy it, but the real kind. The kind that sits wrong on a face that doesn't usually allow it. She believed him. That was the worst part of this entire conversation. She believed that the humiliation was not staged, that Sylvie's engineered pause before the word silhouette had been Sylvie's own particular cruelty, and nothing more orchestrated than the ambient cruelty of spaces that had decided who they were for. She believed that, and it didn't help at all, because the architecture of what surrounded it, the invitation, the history, the overnight acquisition, the financial records in the storage room with his father's signature, that architecture was real, and it meant that she had walked into that building not as a guest who had earned entry, but as a variable in a set of arrangements she hadn't been informed existed. I need to go, she said. Elena, I'm not leaving you. She said it evenly, not because she was certain it was true, but because she needed it to be true long enough to get through tonight. I'm not doing anything dramatic. I need to be somewhere that isn't here for the rest of tonight, and I need you to give me that. He looked at her. Something moved through his face. She watched it cross and disappear before she could name it fully. Okay, he said. She took her bag. She took her jacket. She went to the door, and her hand was on the handle before she stopped and turned back. How many other things, she said, are connected to you that I don't know about? I'm not asking you to confess everything right now. I'm asking, honestly, from wherever you have honesty left tonight, how many things in my life are adjacent to your world in ways I've never been told? He held her gaze for a long moment. I'll tell you everything, he said. When you're ready, I'll tell you all of it. That's not an answer. It's the only one I can give you tonight that won't make things worse. She left. She went to Jade's apartment because it was the only place she could go where the person would not ask her to explain herself before she was ready. Jade opened the door, took one look at her, stepped aside to let her in, and did not say a single word for 20 minutes while Elena sat on the couch and stared at the middle distance and processed the architecture of the past several weeks in a new light. When she finally started talking, it came out less organized than she'd have liked. She told Jade about the signature, about the confirmation, about the timeline of the invitation. She told her about the 15 years. She told her about it my father's suggestion and what those 4 words rearranged in the sequence she'd believed was true. Jade sat across from her and listened without interrupting, which was, Elena thought, among the most useful things another person could do. When Elena finished, Jade was quiet for a moment. "Do you think he loves you?" Jade asked. "That's not the question." "I know it's not the question. Do you think he loves you?" Elena looked at the wall. "Yes." "Do you think he intended for you to be hurt?" "No." "Do you think he knows the difference between protecting someone and controlling the environment they live in?" A long pause. "I'm not sure he does. Or I'm not sure he used to." She turned her coffee mug in her hands. "That's not the same as not loving me. I know that. I've always known that. He's capable of both simultaneously, genuine love and the complete inability to leave space that belongs to someone else. So what do you do with that?" "I don't know yet." She set the mug down. "The building's still mine, the vision's still real. Whatever the history of the property is, what I'm building inside it is separate from all of that. The women who are going to walk in there, they have nothing to do with any of this. I'm not going to sacrifice that because my marriage has a complicated week." That's the most Elena Vale sentence you've ever said. Despite everything, a small, exhausted approximation of a smile crossed her face. Then it left. "But I need space from him," she said. "Not permanently, not as a statement. I need a few days where I'm not sleeping next to someone who I'm trying to simultaneously believe in and figure out how angry to be at." "Guest room's made up," Jade said. "I made it up when you called from the car." Elena looked at her. "I know you," Jade said simply. She threw herself into the rebuild with an intensity that concerned Rosa and energized the crew and produced within 10 days a space that was beginning to look like something that had never existed in this city before. The partial wall between the main floor and the rear section came down on the third morning, and Elena stood in the opening it left and looked at the unified space and felt, despite everything, the specific satisfaction of a room becoming what it was supposed to be. She designed as she always designed, from the body outward, from the question of how does a woman feel when she walks in here, rather than what does this space communicate about the brand. She sourced new inventory personally, calling designers she had relationships with, some established and some emerging, specifying ranges and proportions, and the particular requirement that nothing on the floor would exist only in limited size runs. She hired staff through a process that made Rosa raise her eyebrows. Extensive interviews, scenario-based training, a whole afternoon dedicated specifically to the language of service and the way certain phrases, delivered with polished smiles, could function as weapons. She saw Damien twice in those 10 days. Both times were brief and careful and honest in the way that two people are honest when they're trying to find their way back to a place they can both stand. The second time, he said, "Tell me what you need me to do." She looked at him for a moment. "Keep your father away from this building." He nodded. "And talk to me," she said, "not after things are decided, not when the arrangement is already in place, before. Talk to me before." "I know," he said. "I need you to actually do it, not just know it." "I know that too," he said, and it was the most self-aware sentence she had heard from him in recent memory. She almost reached for him. She stopped herself. Not because she didn't want to, but because some things needed more time than 10 days, and she had learned, at 31, that pushing herself through grief at speed was how she had accumulated years of unprocessed weight that showed up later in her body, in her jaw, in the tension she carried between her shoulder blades that no amount of good work could fully release. They needed more time. She was willing to take it. The renovation was 2 weeks from completion when Marcus called. Elena was on site reviewing the final lighting installation with Rosa when her phone showed the number. She almost didn't answer. Marcus was Damien's lawyer, not hers, and his calls historically preceded information she wasn't ready for. But something in the particular persistence of the buzz, 3 times in a row, made her step away from Rosa and press the phone to her ear. "Marcus," she said. "Mrs. Voss." His voice had the controlled urgency of a man who had practiced delivering bad news so many times it had become technical. "I apologize for calling directly. I've been trying to reach Damien for 20 minutes and he's in a meeting he can't step out of. I need someone with direct access to the renovation site to hear this in the next 10 minutes. Something cold moved through her chest. "I'm on site now," she said. "What is it?" "We've identified the source of the original leak," he said. "The footage from Maison Blanc. It wasn't random. The individual who filmed and uploaded it was compensated to be there that day. Compensated to be in position before you arrived and to capture whatever happened. The job site noise continued around her. The drill of a crew member, Rosa's voice giving directions, the scratch of movement on the new floors. Elena registered all of it from a distance. Compensated by who? She said. A man named Carver, Marcus said. He's been with Damien's organization for 11 years. Currently holds a senior position in the Eastern operations. She processed this. He's one of Damien's people. Yes. So this was internal. It appears so. We're still building the full picture, but what we have is enough to be certain of the direction. A pause. Mrs. Voss, there's something else. She closed her eyes briefly, opened them. Go ahead. The saleswoman, the one who made the comment. She was contacted 6 months ago. She was given specific coaching on how to respond if a woman matching your description came in. Not to cause a scene, not to be overtly hostile, but to deliver precisely the kind of humiliation that would read as routine discrimination on camera while being pointed enough to provoke a response. The drill had stopped. Rosa was looking at her from across the room. Elena turned slightly away. So she knew I was coming, Elena said. Someone knew you were going to receive the invitation. Someone who knew your connection to Damien and understood exactly how he would respond to seeing you treated that way. The goal was never to humiliate you personally, Mrs. Voss. The goal was to use you to expose him, to make him act publicly and emotionally in a way he never has before, to force him to reveal that he had something to lose. The words arranged themselves in front of her like objects she needed to step around. They'll come at the thing you couldn't stop yourself from protecting. Damien's father had known. He had known that night when he called and Damien had stepped out and the door hadn't quite closed. He had known before that. He had known because men like Damien's father spent their lives mapping exactly this kind of vulnerability in exactly this kind of enemy. Someone in Damien's organization had wanted him exposed, had used her to do it, had stood her in the middle of that showroom, had dressed the trap in an invitation on cream-colored paper with handwritten ink and a wax seal, and had used her completely without her knowledge, without her consent, without even the basic courtesy of understanding that she was a person and not a mechanism. She was a tool. To someone who had watched her husband for years, she was simply the most efficient available tool. Her hand holding the phone was not shaking. She was surprised by that again, the same way she had been surprised in the storage room. She had expected her body to react with more drama. Instead, there was just the cold and the stillness and the particular clarity that sometimes arrives when something is so much worse than expected that the emotional system simply has to pause before it can respond. "Where's Carver now?" she asked. "We're locating him. Damien will be briefed the moment his meeting ends." "Don't tell Damien I called," she said. "Let him hear it from you directly. I'll talk to him tonight." "Mrs. Voss, I need an hour to think before this becomes a conversation," she said. "Give me that." A pause, then 1 hour. After that, I have no choice. She ended the call. Rosa had moved closer, not intrusively, but close enough that Elena could see the concern on her face. Elena looked at her and said, "Give me 20 minutes," and walked out the front entrance of the building onto the cold street and stood on the sidewalk with the raw November air moving across her face and tried to find, somewhere inside herself, the ground she needed to stand on. She had been humiliated. That was where this started. A woman in a beautiful room who had decided, in a fraction of a second, that Elena did not deserve to stand among the things she had come to see. That was the origin point. Small and specific and cruel in the ordinary human way. Not engineered, not calculated, just the flat reflexive cruelty of a person who had been given just enough power over an environment to express the worst of what they believed. But around that ordinary cruelty, someone had built a machine. Someone had known that Damien Voss, a man who had operated for 13 years without showing anyone what he cared about, would walk into a room and see his wife's face and forget, for one catastrophic moment, how to be untouchable. Someone had waited for that moment with a camera and a plan, and a saleswoman on a retainer and a man named Carver who had spent 11 years earning Damien's trust. She stood on the sidewalk and looked at the front of the building. Her building, her vision, the space she had been rebuilding for 2 weeks out of something she had decided would become hope rather than revenge. They had used her body. They had used her face, her size, the particular way the world had treated her for 31 years. And they had built a trap around it, knowing she would walk into it, believing she had earned her place. The rage that moved through her then was not hot. It was not the kind that made noise. It was cold and total and structural, settling into her bones with a weight that she suspected was permanent, not the temporary anger she had learned to process and release, but something foundational, something that was going to change the way she stood in the world from this point forward. She went back inside. Rosa looked at her and said nothing. Elena looked at the floor, the new floors, the marble she had chosen for its warmth rather than its impressiveness. And then she looked at the wall that was no longer there, the empty space where the partition had been, the room that was beginning to breathe differently than it had for 61 years. "Are we still on schedule?" she asked. Rosa blinked. "For the reopening?" "Yes. 2 weeks, if the signage delivery isn't delayed." "Good." Elena picked up her clipboard. "Show me the lighting in the dressing rooms. I want to check the angles on the east wall." She worked for 4 more hours. She did not cry. She did not make any calls. She did not make any decisions about what came next. She worked because the work was real, and it was hers. And no one, not Sylvie, not Carver, not the man who had built the trap, not the entirety of the world her husband moved through, had touched it. It existed because she had built it. Whatever happened next could not unmake that. She was on site until 7, and she was nearly at the exit when she heard Rosa's voice call from the back of the building with an urgency that was different from the urgency of renovation problems. "Miss Vale?" Rosa was standing in the doorway of the storage room. "You need to see this." Elena went. The storage room was different from how she had left it the day she found the document box. The shelving units were pulled away from the wall. The cardboard boxes were scattered. The document box was gone. Not simply moved, but gone. The empty rectangle of undisturbed dust marking where it had sat, making the shape of its own absence. And on the floor of the storage room, scattered in a way that was not accidental, placed, deliberately placed, were photographs. Dozens of them. 8 by 10 prints, the kind produced by a professional camera or a professional printer. And in each of them was Elena. Not surveillance photographs, not images taken from a distance. These were taken up close, across multiple locations, outside her studio, outside Jade's apartment, at the renovation site on various days. In several of them, she was on the phone. In several, she was arriving or leaving. In one, she was standing exactly where she was standing now, taken through the storage room's single small window. Someone had been watching her. Not her husband, not Carver. Someone who was watching the situation escalate in real time and had decided in the past day or 2 or 3 that it was time for Elena Vale to know she was being watched. It was not a threat. It was a demonstration. "We are closer than you understand. We have been watching longer than you realize. And whatever you are building here belongs to a story that does not end the way you have planned." Rosa was looking at her with an expression that had moved past professional concern into something more personal. "Should I call—" "No," Elena said. "Don't call anyone." She crouched and picked up one of the photographs. Herself on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks ago, standing outside the building's entrance with coffee in one hand and her clipboard in the other, wearing an expression of focused concentration that she had not known anyone was observing. She looked at it for a long moment. "Get everyone off site for tonight," she said. "Tell them there's a plumbing issue. Don't explain anything else." "Elena." "Rosa." She looked up. "I need 24 hours. After that, I'll handle it. But right now I need you to get your crew home, and I need you to trust me." Rosa looked at her for a moment, long enough that Elena understood she was being measured and that the measurement's outcome mattered, and then she nodded. Elena waited until she heard the last crew member leave. Then she sat down on the floor of the storage room on the cold marble, surrounded by photographs of herself, and she called the one number she had not planned to call tonight. It rang twice. "Elena," Damien said. And in the single word she could hear that Marcus had already talked to him, that he knew about Carver, that his voice carried the specific controlled stillness of a man standing at the edge of something he was trying to decide how to step back from. "I'm at the building," she said. A pause. "Are you okay?" "Come here," she said. "Now. And come alone." She ended the call. She looked at the photographs spread across the floor around her. Her own face, multiplied, looking back at her from a dozen different mornings she had believed were private. She had spent 31 years learning how to walk into rooms that didn't want her and stand in them anyway. She had spent 9 years learning how to love a man whose world had edges she couldn't always see. She had spent the past several weeks believing, with genuine conviction, that she was building something that existed outside all of that, outside the politics and the histories and the careful arrangements of men who moved through the world like it belonged to them. She understood now that there was no outside. Not for her. Not anymore. If she was going to finish what she'd started, if the women she had envisioned walking through these doors were actually going to walk through them, she was going to have to fight for it in a way she had never fought for anything. Not with Damien's resources, not behind Damien's name, but not ignorant of the world she was standing in either. She heard his car outside. She stood up, straightened her jacket, and faced the door. Whatever was coming through it, she was not going to meet it on her knees. He came alone. She heard the car first. One engine, no convoy, no second set of doors opening and closing. She had not been certain he would honor that. She was glad he had. Damien stepped through the front entrance of the building and moved through the darkened main floor toward the storage room without calling out her name, which meant he already knew exactly where she was, which meant the building had eyes he had placed that she had not asked about and probably would not ask about tonight because there were only so many things she could process in a single evening. He stopped in the doorway of the storage room and looked at the floor, at the photographs, at the shape of the absent document box in the dust. His face moved through something rapid and internal that he compressed before it fully surfaced, but she was watching closely and she saw the compression happening and she understood what was underneath it. Rate, controlled, but total. How long have they been watching you? He said. Not a question. I don't know, she said. Long enough to have been here while the crew was on site. He crouched and picked up one of the photographs, the one of her through the storage room window, and looked at it for a moment with an expression that was the closest thing to naked she had ever seen on his face. This is Carver, he said. Marcus told you. An hour ago. He set the photograph down, stood. His jaw was working. I should have... He stopped. Don't, she said. Don't do the thing where you explain what you should have seen. I need you functional right now, not sorry. He looked at her. Something in his eyes recalibrated. Okay, he said. Tell me everything you found. Start from the document box. She told him. She did it the way she had organized it in her head during the hour before he arrived, chronologically, specifically, without editorializing. She told him about the dates on the financial records, the holding company letterhead, the progression of signatures. She told him about Marcus's call, about Carver, about the saleswoman who had been coached 6 months in advance. She told him about standing on the sidewalk outside and understanding, for the first time, the full shape of what had been built around her. He listened the way he listened when it mattered, completely, without interrupting, without allowing his expression to become a distraction from what she was saying. By the time she finished, the storage room felt smaller than it had before, the walls closer, the single bulb throwing its flat shadows across both their faces. He's been with you 11 years, she said. Yes. And you didn't see it? No. Why Carver? Of everyone, why would he? Power, Damien said flatly. He's been in the same position for 3 years. He expected to move up after Rennick retired 18 months ago. I gave that position to someone else. His voice was even, informational. He's been patient. Whatever you think about the man, he's been patient. Patient enough to spend 6 months coaching a saleswoman. Patient enough to spend 6 months building a plan that would expose me without being traceable to him. The filming, the upload, the public narrative. He stopped. His hand went to the back of his neck briefly, the only physical tell she had ever reliably identified in him. He was working very hard at something. He counted on me reacting. He counted on me buying the building and making it personal and public. He got what he wanted. And now he wants to make sure I know he can reach me, Elena said. That's what the photographs are. He's not threatening me. He's demonstrating. He wants me to go to you, and he wants you to react again. Bigger this time. Damien looked at her. He wants you to go after him directly, she said. He wants the kind of response that takes you outside the lines. Something the other families, the regulators, everyone watching, he wants them to see you lose control. I know what he wants. Then you know you can't give it to him. The storage room was very quiet. Outside, somewhere distant, traffic moved through the city doing what traffic did. The building settled around them with its old sounds, the particular creaking of a structure that had held many different kinds of weight over 60 years. Elena. His voice was quieter now. I need you to go to Jade's tonight. I need to know you're... I'm not going to Jade's. I'm not asking. I know you're not asking. I'm telling you anyway. She held his gaze. I'm not leaving this building. Whatever Carver thinks he's communicating by putting those photographs on the floor, my response is to not move. To stay exactly where I am and finish what I started. Because if I leave tonight, he wins the first round, and I'm not doing that. This isn't a fashion show. The rules are... I know what the rules are. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she let it because she was tired of spending energy holding things together that needed to crack. I have known, for 9 years, that the rules of your world are different from the rules of mine. I have lived next to those rules, and I have chosen every morning to stay in a lane that was mine and let you stay in yours. And for 9 years that worked because the 2 lanes didn't touch. She pressed her fingers against the doorframe. They're touching now, Damien. Carver made them touch. So I don't get to pretend I'm separate from this anymore, and I am not going to Jade's apartment and waiting in a guest room while you handle it without me. He stared at her. She stared back. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He reached for it without looking away from her, glanced at the screen, and whatever he saw there made something shift rapidly behind his eyes. We need to go, he said. What? Now. Out the back. My car. Damien, what is... Carver's not watching the building, he said, and his voice had changed. The even control stripped down to something more functional, faster, the voice of someone moving through a checklist at speed. He's already moved. Marcus just sent... We need to go. She grabbed her bag from the floor. She followed him through the main showroom toward the service exit at the back of the building, through a door she hadn't used before, into a narrow alley that smelled of cold concrete and the city's particular overnight breath. His car was there, not where he had parked it coming in, which meant someone had moved it, which meant he hadn't come entirely alone, which she filed away and did not address. They were moving in 60 seconds. The car pulled into traffic, and Damien was on the phone before she had her seatbelt on. Tell me the location, he said into the phone. A pause. How many? Another pause, shorter. Don't move until I call you back. He ended the call and looked straight ahead. Tell me, Elena said. Carver called a meeting. Tonight, last hour, he reached out to the 2 Eastern families directly. He's positioning himself as a replacement, telling them I've lost operational clarity, that the boutique situation proves I make decisions based on emotion and not strategy. Damien's hands on the wheel were completely still. He's making his move tonight because he knows I found out about the photographs and he knows I know it was him. He's not waiting anymore. What does that mean? What does he do at this meeting? He presents an alternative, himself, with the argument that I'm a liability. And the families listen? They always listen. His voice was flat. That's the world. Loyalty is circumstantial. The moment someone looks stronger than the person they're loyal to, the calculation changes. Elena looked at his profile. The streetlights moved across his face in strips, illuminating him in intervals. He looked, in this moment, like the version of himself she rarely saw directly. Not the husband in the kitchen, not the man who held her hand in the car, but the other one. The one that had built 13 years of untouchable silence. The one his enemies had cataloged as a variable they could never fully predict. What are you going to do? She said. I'm going to go to that meeting. She stared at him. What? Not to confront him, to walk in. He glanced at her briefly. The moment I walk into the room, everything he's selling becomes unsellable. You can't convince 2 families that a man lacks operational clarity and then have that man appear, unannounced, in full control, before you finish the sentence. And if something goes wrong, nothing will go wrong. Damien. Elena. He looked at the road. I've been doing this for 13 years. I know how to walk into a room. She sat back. Her hands were in her lap, and she was looking at the city sliding past. And she was thinking about all the rooms he had walked into that she had never been told about. All the silences he had arrived in and rearranged without anyone outside his world ever knowing. 13 years of that. And she had lived beside it, in her parallel lane, designing and building and growing something that was entirely separate. The lanes were touching. "I'm coming with you," she said. The car was silent for 3 full seconds. "No," he said. "I'm not asking." "Elena, this is not a boutique situation?" Her voice was sharp and she let it be. "Carver used me to get to you. He put my face on those photographs. He is walking into a meeting tonight where the argument on the table involves my existence as your vulnerability. I'm not sitting in this car while that conversation happens without me in the room. You don't understand what kind of room. I understand exactly what kind of room." She turned to face him fully. "I have been in rooms where people decided I didn't belong for my entire adult life. I have been assessed and dismissed and directed to the back section more times than you have ever had to consider. I know how to stand in a room that does not want me there. I have been doing it since I was 19 years old." Her voice didn't break. She wouldn't let it. "You walk in there alone, and Carver spends the rest of his life telling the story of how Damien Voss came running when he snapped his fingers. You walk in there with me, and you change the story entirely." His jaw was tight. His eyes were on the road. "You're not a prop," he said, and the word choice surprised her enough that she paused. "I know I'm not a prop," she said. "I'm a person. Your person. And I am telling you right now that I choose to be in that room, not because you need me there, because I need to be there." He drove for another block without speaking. Then he exhaled, one short, controlled breath that she felt more than heard, and reached for his phone and made a call and said 3 words to whoever answered. "Change the number." That was all. He put the phone down. She didn't ask what it meant. She understood from the way he had said it that it was an instruction she was not meant to decode. And for once, she let that be true. The meeting was in a restaurant that had been closed for 3 hours. Ground floor of a building in the financial district. The kind of establishment that had private dining rooms accessible through an entrance that didn't appear on the public-facing floor plan. Damien pulled into an underground structure 2 blocks away, and they walked the distance in the cold. Elena in the coat she'd had on all day. Damien slightly ahead and slightly to her left, close without being in front. She heard the room before she entered it, not loudly. There was no loudness. That was never how these things worked. She understood that instinctively from years of overhearing late-night conversations and telephone calls from other rooms. The sound was controlled, low frequency. Men who had learned to conduct significant conversations without raising their voices. Damien stopped outside the private room's door. He turned to look at her. "Whatever happens in there," he said, "stay close and don't speak unless I ask you to." "And if I disagree?" Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, the ghost of one. "Then I trust your judgment." He pushed the door open. The room held 8 people. A long table with the remains of a dinner that had been cleared to the edges. 5 men she didn't know, 3 of whom looked up with expressions that cycled rapidly from surprise to calculation. A woman she also didn't know, seated at the near end with a glass of water and an expression of someone who had learned to neutralize her face in situations requiring it. And Carver. He was seated near the center of the table, and he was, she realized, not what she had constructed in her head. She had built him as someone physically imposing because the scale of what he had done demanded someone who looked like they were capable of it. But Carver was compact, gray-haired at the temples, with the kind of face that was difficult to remember after you left the room. He was wearing a dark jacket, and his hands were flat on the table, and when Damien stepped through the door, his expression performed surprise quite well, not well enough. "Damien," he said. Warm, steady, completely controlled. "I didn't expect—" "I know," Damien said. He walked to the head of the table, the end farthest from Carver, and stood there and did not sit down. Elena moved to his right. She felt every eye in the room make the calculation she was accustomed to people making, the assessment, the placement, the decision about where she fit in the architecture of the situation. She stood with her shoulders level and her chin at the angle that cost nothing to maintain, and met each gaze briefly and held it long enough to be registered. One of the men she didn't know. Heavy-set, silver rings on both hands, the ease of someone accustomed to being the most significant person in a room, looked at Damien and said, "This is irregular." "Yes," Damien said. "Irregular suggests you already knew about the nature of this gathering." "I know everything about the nature of this gathering," Damien said. That's why I'm here instead of where you expected me to be. The man's eyes moved to Elena, assessed, moved back to Damien. And you brought my wife, Damien said. Simple, complete. A sentence that didn't require expansion. Carver had not moved. His hands were still flat on the table. His expression had not changed in any way that a casual observer would notice. But Elena was not a casual observer, and she was watching the places his body language failed him. The almost imperceptible tension in his shoulders, the way his right thumb had pressed down slightly harder against the table surface, the single blink that lasted a quarter second too long when Damien said, "My wife." He had not expected her. She had not been in his calculation. That understanding moved through her like something physical, not warmth, not satisfaction, something colder and more structural. She had spent her life being underestimated. She had spent years walking into rooms where her presence was not anticipated and had learned to make use of the gap between what people expected and what they got. She knew this terrain. She had been navigating it since before she could name it. Damien looked at Carver. "Stand up," he said. The room tightened. It was not a dramatic command. He said it the way he said most things, without performance, which made it more absolute than shouting. Carver looked at him. The calculation behind his eyes was visible, for the first time, in the way calculations are visible when the environment changes faster than the plan can accommodate. He had built this evening on specific premises. Damien's absence, Damien's emotional volatility, Damien's exposed vulnerability as a husband who could be manipulated through his wife. He had built 11 months of planning on those premises, and they were collapsing in real time around a table full of people who were watching him collapse. He stood. "I want you to tell every person in this room," Damien said, "what you told them before I walked in. Repeat it, all of it." Carver said nothing. "Go ahead." The silence stretched. The man with the silver rings was watching with an expression of genuine interest that suggested he had attended many of these evenings, but rarely one with this specific dynamic. The woman at the near end had not moved. "No?" Damien said. "Then I'll do it." He looked around the table. "He told you I was compromised, that the boutique purchase was proof of emotional decision-making, that I had revealed a vulnerability, my wife, that could be exploited by anyone willing to be creative." He paused. He was not entirely wrong about the vulnerability. I won't insult anyone here by pretending otherwise. His eyes moved back to Carver. What he didn't calculate was the difference between a vulnerability and a liability. "My wife is the first. I am not the second. Pretty speech, Carver said, and his voice was still controlled, still almost warm. But there was something underneath it now. Not panic, something more disciplined than panic. Something that had decided if it was going down, committed. Doesn't change what everyone in this room saw. You bought a building because someone was rude to your wife. That's not operational clarity. That's a man who's lost. "I have the financial records," Damien said. Carver stopped. "The ones from the storage room," Damien said. "Before you had them removed, they were photographed. All of them." He reached into his jacket and produced a folded document, which he set flat on the table without opening it. "Your name appears on a series of payments made through an intermediary account over the past 11 months. The recipient of those payments includes a woman named Sylvie, who was employed at Maison Blanc as of 8 months ago." He let that sit for exactly 3 seconds. The same account was used to compensate the individual who filmed and uploaded the original footage. Another 3 seconds. "And the same account has a parent account that traces to a holding entity you incorporated 17 months ago, 7 months before you were passed over for Rennick's position." The room was completely still. Elena was watching Carver's hands. The right thumb had stopped pressing. It had lifted off the table entirely, which was a small thing, the smallest possible thing. But she had learned years ago that the smallest movements in a body were the ones that cost the most to perform. "You've been building this for 17 months, Damien said. "You built it carefully. You built it with patience and intelligence, and you executed every stage of it with exactly the operational clarity you've spent the past hour telling these people I no longer have." He picked up the folded document and put it back in his jacket. "I want every person in this room to sit with that for a moment. Carver's plan worked. I did react emotionally. I bought the building publicly, and I made my position visible, and he was right that it created an opening. He looked around the table, and she could see in each face the specific attention of people who had spent their lives measuring power in the way animals measure it, through presence, through stillness, through the quality of silence around a person who knows what they are doing. The opening closed, Damien said. It closed because I have a wife who is smarter than I gave myself credit for being married to, and because she found what Carver left in a building he didn't know I would eventually give her access to, and because she told me everything before Carver had finished executing the last stage of his plan. He looked at Carver for a long moment. You used her to try to destroy me, he said. You used her body, her history, the way this world has treated her since before she knew my name. And you built a weapon out of it. That's what I can't forgive. Not the ambition, not the plan. The instrument you chose. Carver's jaw was moving slightly, working at something. Then, you think bringing her here changes? I didn't bring her, Damien said. She chose to come. One of the other men, quiet until now, seated at the table's right side with the stillness of someone who would be the most dangerous person in the room if the room were arranged differently, looked at Elena for the first time with full attention rather than peripheral assessment. Mrs. Voss, he said. His voice was low, accented slightly, European somewhere. Your husband says you found the documents. I did, Elena said. What prompted you to look? The door was open, she said. I was walking through a building I was rebuilding. I moved boxes that were in my way and found something that explained why the building wasn't accidental. She held his gaze. I also understood that what was on the floor tonight, the photographs, was not a threat. It was a question, whether I would run or stay. And you stayed. I always stay, she said. That's the one thing everyone in this situation has consistently miscalculated. The room was quiet. The man with the silver rings exhaled. Not dramatically, just a breath, the kind that releases a decision that's been held too long. He looked at Carver. He looked at Damien. He looked at the folded document that was back in Damien's jacket. I want that account documentation, he said to Damien. Not a request. You'll have it by morning, Damien said. The man nodded once. Looked at Carver with an expression that contained no warmth and no anger, and nothing personal at all. The most terrible kind of assessment, the one that treats a person as a problem to be resolved rather than a human being to feel anything about. Carver read it. She watched him read it. She watched something final happen behind his eyes. Not defeat exactly, but the specific recognition of a man who has played everything forward in his mind and arrived at an end with no continuation. He sat back down. Not in surrender. In the particular stillness of someone who has stopped moving and is deciding how to hold themselves in a situation that has resolved against them. Damien looked at him for one more moment. Then he looked at Elena. Ready? He said. She had expected some part of her. The part that had grown up watching films where climaxes involved confrontation and culminating speeches and the visible collapse of the antagonist. She had expected to feel something triumphant. Instead, she felt the cold of the room and the weight of the evening in her legs, and the particular exhaustion that lives not in the muscles but somewhere deeper, behind the eyes, in the place where sustained alertness eventually goes when it finally releases. Yes, she said. They walked out. In the corridor outside the private room, Damien stopped and leaned one hand against the wall and dropped his head briefly. 1 second, maybe 2. And she understood that the stillness in that room had cost him exactly as much as it would have cost her, that he had performed a version of the same controlled composure she had been performing in spaces that didn't want her for 12 years, and that it was exhausting for him too in ways he never showed anyone. She put her hand on his back, between his shoulder blades, flat, present. He straightened, turned, looked at her. The building, he said. The reopening. 2 weeks, she said. You're still doing it. Did you think I wasn't? He looked at her face for a long moment. No, he said. I never thought that. They walked out of the building into the cold night, and the city received them the way cities always did. Indifferently, continuously, already moving on to its next thing. And Elena breathed the cold air and felt, somewhere in the architecture of her chest, The weight of everything that had been balanced on this evening began to distribute itself more evenly. It was not over. She knew it was not over. Carver was still in that room, still breathing, and the documentation that Damien would send by morning would resolve certain things and leave others unresolved in the way that human situations always left remainders no formal process could eliminate. The building still needed 2 weeks of work. The staff still needed training. The inventory still needed final curation. She still had a marriage to continue repairing, slowly and without shortcuts, in the way that damaged things require specific sustained attention rather than dramatic singular moments. None of it was over. But she was standing. She was standing in the cold outside a restaurant in the financial district at 10:47 on a Thursday night, with her husband beside her and her project 2 weeks from completion and her name on a building she had rebuilt from the inside out. And she was standing. They were halfway to the car when her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Jade. She answered. "I'm fine," she said before Jade could speak. "I'll explain everything tomorrow." "That's not—" Jade's voice was strange, stripped of its usual texture. "Elena, I'm at the building. I came to get some files I left. I'm standing outside the building right now." Elena stopped walking. "The windows," Jade said. "Elena, the windows are, She heard it through the phone before Jade finished the sentence. Not an explosion, not the dramatic sound effects of film destruction, just the particular sharp percussion of glass, and then another, and then the quieter, continuous sound of something inside giving way. She was already running. She ran the 2 blocks. Damien was faster, but he stayed beside her, which she registered without processing because her entire processing capacity was occupied by what she could see from half a block away. The front windows of the building blown outward, glass across the sidewalk catching the streetlight in 100 scattered pieces, and Jade standing at the edge of the debris with her phone still pressed to her ear and her other hand covering her mouth. Elena reached her and grabbed her arm. "Are you hurt?" "No, I was outside. I heard... It happened fast. It was..." Jade's voice was doing something it almost never did, which was lose its architecture entirely. "Someone was inside, Elena. The lights were on when I walked up. They weren't on when I left at 6. Damien was already on his phone, not running but moving with a purposefulness that covered ground efficiently toward the service entrance at the side of the building. She watched him go and made the decision in under a second. "Stay here," she told Jade. "Elena..." She followed Damien. The service entrance was intact. He had it open by the time she reached him, and she followed him in through the back, through the corridor that ran alongside the storage room, and the smell hit her before the sight did. Not fire, not smoke, but the particular cold, sharp smell of destruction, of things that had been intact and weren't anymore. Chemicals, maybe. Something solvent-based. And underneath it, the smell of fabric, shredded fabric. Fabric that had been many things and was now many smaller things scattered across a floor she had chosen herself. They came through into the main showroom and she stopped. She had expected bad. She had prepared herself in the 15 seconds between Jade's voice and this room for bad. It was worse than bad. Every gown that had been hung in preparation for the reopening, the inventory she had spent 3 weeks sourcing and curating and arranging with the specific care of someone who understood that the right garment in the right space could make a woman feel like a different version of herself, a version she'd been waiting to meet. Every one of them had been cut, not removed, cut. Still on their hangers in many cases, slashed with something that had moved through the fabric efficiently and without hesitation. The display cases along the east wall, new cases installed 6 days ago, the glass she had chosen for the way it diffused light rather than throwing it, were shattered. The mirrors, the 3 floor-length mirrors positioned near the entrance that she had placed to catch the morning light, were destroyed. And on the wall behind the main display, written in something dark and thick that she did not examine closely, were 5 words. "You never belonged here anyway." She stood in the middle of the destruction and looked at it. Her chest was doing something complex that she did not have immediate language for. Not grief exactly. Not the white-hot thing she'd felt in the storage room when she understood what Carver had built. Something older than those. Something that lived beneath both of them, in the specific place where a person keeps the cumulative weight of every moment they have been told, in one register or another, that the space they are standing in was not designed for them. She had heard this sentence before. Not in these words, not written on a wall, but in Sylvie's engineered pause before the word silhouette, in the boardroom where the investor had looked past her shoulder when she was speaking, in the fabric shop at 19 where the woman behind the counter had mentioned Maison Blanc the way you mentioned something on another planet. She had heard this sentence in every configuration a human being can deliver it, polished and raw and disguised and bare, for 31 years. She looked at it on the wall, and then she took out her phone and photographed it. Damien was behind her. She could feel him there without turning around, not touching her, just present, giving her whatever this moment required. She had not heard him say anything since they entered the room. She did not know what his face looked like right now, and she did not turn to check. "Carver did this," she said. "It would have been ordered before the meeting," Damien said. "Set in motion before he knew how the evening was going to end. A contingency. If everything else failed, He stopped. "He wanted me to stop," she said. "He wanted me to look at this and understand that the cost of continuing was too high." Damien was quiet. She lowered her phone, looked at the wall again. The 5 words, patient and absolute, occupying the space above the display area where she had planned to hang the first piece of the new collection, a gown designed by a 24-year-old woman from a neighborhood 2 miles east of here who had sent Elena a portfolio 6 years ago and whom Elena had been waiting for the right platform to properly introduce. "Call Rosa," Elena said. "It's almost midnight. Call Rosa. Call every member of the crew that worked this renovation. Tell them I need them here tomorrow morning at 8. She put her phone back in her bag. "And then call whoever you need to call to get Carver processed through the right channels. I don't want anything dramatic. I want documentation, legal process, and I want it done in a way that doesn't create another news cycle." She finally turned to look at him. His face was controlled, but his eyes were doing something she rarely saw them do, which was carry the full weight of what he felt without the layer of management between the feeling and the surface. He looked like a man standing in a room that destroyed something he cared about, because he was. "I will spend the rest of my life," he said, "making sure this never—" "Don't," she said. Not harshly, just a door gently closed. "Don't make promises about the future right now. Just be here. Help me figure out the next 2 weeks. He held her gaze. Something settled in him. She could see it settle, the way water levels after the disturbance that displaced it. "Okay," he said. "And Damien?" She looked at him clearly, at this man she had chosen and was still choosing despite everything, at this face she had memorized over 9 years in all its configurations. "Before you make a single call, before you contact Marcus or anyone else, I need you to do something first." "What?" "Ask me," she said. "Ask me what I need. Not what you've already decided I need, what I actually need right now." The room was very quiet. Outside, she could hear Jade's voice distantly, on the phone with someone, managing something the way Jade always managed things, practically and completely. Inside, there was just the cold and the smell of cut fabric and the stillness of destruction. Damien looked at her for a long moment. "What do you need?" he said. Not performed, not hollow. He was genuinely asking. She could see him genuinely asking, could see the effort of it. For a man whose first language was action, whose entire formation had been built around the premise that love meant anticipating and eliminating, that care was demonstrated through preemptive force. She could see how much it cost him to hold the question open and wait. "I need 2 weeks," she said. "I need you to make the legal calls and the financial calls and whatever needs to happen with Carver to happen, and I need you to do all of that quietly and without headlines. And I need the front of this building to be cleaned up by morning because I don't want Jade to stand on that sidewalk with glass around her feet any longer than necessary." She paused. "And then I need you to step back and let me rebuild this. Again. Because that's what I'm going to do." "I know it is," he said. "Do you need me to explain why?" "No," he said, and the simplicity of it. No justification, no caveat, just the plain statement of a man who had, somewhere in the past several weeks, learned how to recognize something without needing it explained to him, landed differently than most things he had said to her recently. She nodded, turned back to the room, looked at the wall. "That comes down first," she said. "That whole section of wall. I was going to keep it, but now it comes down and we open the back completely. Every inch of separation, gone." She pulled out her notebook and started writing. Rosa arrived at 7:45. She took one look at the room, said nothing for about 15 seconds, and then said, "What's the timeline?" 12 days, Elena said, "for the reopening." Yes. Rosa looked at the wall, at the words, at the slashed gowns still hanging from their rails like the remnants of something that had been interrupted mid-sentence. "The structure's intact," Rosa said. "Walls, floor, lighting, all of it is intact. The damage is to the inventory and the surface elements." "Yes. So we're not rebuilding. We're replacing and repairing." "Yes." Rosa turned away from the wall and looked at Elena directly. 12 days, she said again, not as a question this time. "Can it be done?" Rosa exhaled through her nose. "Yeah," she said, "it can be done." The crew arrived between 8 and 8:30, most of them clearly pulled from sleep, some of them not quite awake yet. All of them stopping in the doorway for a moment when they saw the room before moving through whatever they felt and going to find Rosa for instructions. Nobody said much. People who worked with their hands for a living tended to respond to destruction by assessing it practically before they felt anything about it, and Elena watched them do that, and felt something that was adjacent to gratitude, but deeper. The specific feeling of watching human beings choose competence over despair. Jade arrived at 8:15 with 3 people Elena didn't recognize, who turned out to be designers. 2 of them people Elena had worked with before, one a name she knew only through their portfolio. And the information that they had called Jade at 6 in the morning after seeing a story on social media about the vandalism, and had asked what they could do. "They want to help with the inventory," Jade said. "Replacement pieces, loans from their current collections. They're not asking for anything in return." Elena looked at the 3 of them across the room. Young, tired, carrying bags that contained, she understood, the kind of work that represented years of their lives. "Tell them I need to see the work first," she said. "Same standard as everything else. Being generous doesn't exempt anyone from quality." Jade smiled for the first time in about 18 hours. "That's what I told them you'd say." Over the next 3 days, the room that should have been finished became the most alive space Elena had worked in since the early years of her studio, when it was just her and one machine and the particular urgency of someone who has nothing to lose yet. People moved through it continuously. Rosa's crew on the structural and surface elements, designers and seamstresses working in the corners she had cleared and outfitted with tables and machines. Jade managing the logistical flow of it all with the focused efficiency that was her specific genius. Elena moved between everything, making decisions with the speed and certainty she was capable of when the clarity arrived. And it had arrived, the morning after the vandalism, with the particular force of things that are clarified by destruction. She knew exactly what she wanted. She had always known. The damage had not changed that. If anything, it had burned away the last residue of uncertainty that complicated things sometimes leave. She was on site 12 to 14 hours a day. She came home to an apartment where Damien was usually awake regardless of the hour, always with something prepared, coffee, food, whatever the time required. And he did not ask how it was going because he could read it from her face when she came in. And he did not offer opinions about the decisions she was making because she had not asked for them. And he did not fill the space between them with anything that required her to manage it. He simply held it open for her and let her take what she needed. On the 4th night, she fell asleep on the couch at 10 o'clock and woke up at 2 in the morning covered with a blanket she hadn't put there, and he was sitting in the chair across from her reading. And when she opened her eyes, he looked up. "Go to bed," he said. "You have 8 days." "I know how many days I have. You'll make better decisions on sleep." "I know that too." She looked at him across the quiet living room, at this man sitting in a chair at 2 in the morning because she was on the couch, and the alternative was going to bed without knowing she was covered. She thought about what his father had said through the barely open door. "They'll come at the thing you couldn't stop yourself from protecting." She thought about how that sentence had made her feel, like a liability, like a vulnerability, like something that needed to be factored into a threat assessment. And she thought about this moment, 2 in the morning, blanket, chair. The particular stillness of a man who had learned, somewhere in the past several weeks, the difference between protecting someone and simply being present for them. "Your father called me," she said. He went still. "Last week," she said, "while you were in the meeting with the Eastern contracts. He called my number directly. I answered because I didn't recognize it." "What did he say?" Damien said. "Flat. Careful. He said that what I was building was going to cause problems that outlasted Carver, that certain people would always use me as the angle because it was the most reliable one. She pulled the blanket straighter across her lap. He said I should consider whether the boutique's public profile was worth the ongoing exposure. He was polite about it. He was very polite. Damien was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately classify. And I told him, she said, that I understood his concern and that I respected his experience in matters like this, and that I was going to open the boutique on the date I had set, and that nothing he had said changed that, and that if he called my number again without being invited to do so, I would have that number blocked. She held Damien's gaze. And then I said goodbye and I went back to work. The living room was very quiet. Something happened in Damien's face that she had never seen before, not in 9 years. It was brief, a few seconds at most, but it was real. And it was the specific expression of a man who has spent his entire life arranging the world around a wound he has never fully examined, and who has just seen someone else handle the source of that wound with more directness than he has ever managed himself. "You didn't tell me," he said. "I'm telling you now." "Why not then?" "Because I didn't need you to handle it," she said. "I handled it. I wanted you to know eventually. That's different." She paused. "That's the difference I've been trying to show you, between handling something for someone and letting them know you trust them to handle it themselves." He sat with that for a moment. She watched him sit with it, watched the processing of it move through him the way things move through him, internally and without drama but visibly, if you knew where to look. "My father," he said, "he's been running things for 40 years by making sure everyone near him stays inside a radius he controls. That includes me." His voice was even, measured, but underneath the measurement was something that had been compressed for a very long time. "He suggested the invitation because he thought it would be good for you. I believe that. He also suggested it because it gave him visibility into a situation he wanted to monitor. I believe that too. Both things are true simultaneously, and that's—" He stopped. "That's who he is. That's always been who he is." "I know," she said. "I've known for years." "And you stayed anyway." "I stayed for you," she said. "Not for him. That was always a separate calculation." He looked at her across the quiet room. Then he said, with the plainness of someone saying a thing that has been true for a long time and is only now being said in the open, "I don't know how to be his son and your husband at the same time. I've never known how. I've been managing the overlap for 9 years and calling it working." "I know that too," she said. "It's going to require—" He paused, choosing the word with care. "Changes that are going to be not easy." "No," she agreed, not easy. "Is that something you're willing to do alongside me?" She looked at him, at the question, which was not small, which was in fact the question underneath every other question they had spent the past several weeks not quite asking. At the man asking it, who was imperfect and catalogued in specific ways, who had spent 9 years loving her in a language that was sometimes the wrong one, who was sitting in a chair at 2 a.m. because she was on the couch. "Yes," she said, "that's something I'm willing to do alongside you." He exhaled. One breath, the quietest release she had ever heard from him. "Go to bed," she said again. "I'll be there in 10 minutes. I'll wait." "Damien." 10 minutes, he said. "I'll wait 10 minutes." She looked at him for another moment. Then she shook her head, not in frustration, in something that was tired and fond and complex in the way that only very long relationships produce, and she pulled the blanket off and folded it over the back of the couch and stood up and held out her hand. He took it. The reopening happened on a Saturday. The morning was clear and cold, the kind of November day that made the city look freshly made, the light hitting the streets at an angle that made everything cast longer shadows than usual. Elena arrived at the building at 6 a.m. to walk through it one final time alone, before anyone else, before the staff arrived and the flowers were delivered and the crowd began to gather outside. She started at the front entrance and walked slowly. The windows had been replaced with a different glass, slightly warmer in tone than the original, diffusing the morning light rather than simply transmitting it. The main floor opened directly into what had been the rear section, the wall entirely gone now, the space continuous and unhierarchical and lit in a way that Rosa had overseen with a precision that Elena could not have specified better herself. warm without being dimmed, bright without the surgical quality that made certain kinds of light feel like scrutiny. The display areas held a collection that was not what she had originally planned and was better, assembled in 8 days from the contributions of 9 designers, including herself, spanning a range of sizes and silhouettes and aesthetics that did not cohere around a single vision of what a bride was supposed to look like, but instead proposed that a bride looked like whoever was standing in the dress. She stopped in the center of the room. She stood in the same physical location where she had stood 6 weeks ago, when Sylvie's open palm had gestured toward the back section and the engineered pause before the word silhouette had sat in the air between them like something meant to wound. She stood in exactly that spot and looked at the room around her and tried to map what she was feeling against the feeling from that day. The humiliation from that day was still there. She would not pretend otherwise. It had not dissolved into the achievement of what came after. That was not how these things worked. They did not cancel each other out. They accumulated, and what you did with the accumulation was the question that defined you. She had decided what to do with it, and the room around her was the answer she had built with her hands, and other people's hands, and whatever she had left in her after everything else had taken its cut. She did not belong in this room. She belonged in every room she decided to enter. The distinction was the whole lesson, the only lesson, the one she had been learning since she was 19 and would probably be learning in its various configurations for the rest of her life. Staff arrived at 8. She had hired 12 people for the boutique's operation, interviewed by herself and Jade over 3 separate sessions, with a training process that had occupied the final days of the renovation. She watched them move through the room now and recognized, in the way they occupied the space, that the training had done what training was supposed to do: not erase who they were and replace it with a performance, but equip them with a specific vocabulary for hospitality that came from genuine attention rather than scripted warmth. Jade appeared at her shoulder at 9:15 with coffee and the look of someone who had been managing logistics since before the sun came up and was running on something more sustainable than sleep. "Press is outside," Jade said. 12 outlets, 3 video, 2 fashion editors who actually matter, and 1 who pretends to. "Which one pretends?" Jade told her. "Let them in anyway," Elena said. "Everyone gets in today." Jade nodded, then quietly, "Are you ready?" Elena looked at the room, at the women on her staff moving through it with competence and care, at the gowns on the rails, the cases along the east wall holding jewelry and accessories from makers she had sourced from 7 different cities, the mirrors positioned to show a woman herself rather than the room's opinion of her. At the wall behind the main display, freshly painted, bare of everything except the name she had given the space in the final days. Val House at Maison Blanc, her name on the building, not as a monument to the man who had purchased it, but as a statement from the woman who had rebuilt it. "Yes," she said, "open the doors." The crowd that came through that day was not the crowd Elena had initially imagined when she first drew the floor plan on a legal pad in Jade's apartment. That imagined crowd had been largely abstract. Women of all sizes, ages, backgrounds. The kind of demographic language that planning requires, but that means almost nothing until the actual human beings arrive. The actual human beings arrived. They arrived in their 40s and their 60s and their 20s. They arrived in groups and alone. They arrived with the specific caution of people who have been made to feel unwelcome in spaces like this one before: shoulders slightly forward, movement slightly tentative, the bodily posture of someone prepared to be redirected. And Elena watched that caution shift, incrementally and then all at once, as the room received them. As the staff moved toward them instead of assessing them from a distance. As the light fell on them in a way that was generous. As the space, simply by its arrangement and its atmosphere, communicated something that spaces almost never communicate, that they had been expected. She spoke in the early afternoon when the room had reached a density that meant people were standing along the walls and in the corridor, and some of them were outside looking in through the new windows. She had not prepared a speech with notes. She stood near the center of the room and spoke from the place where the previous 6 weeks had brought her. She talked about the invitation. She talked about walking in and believing, genuinely believing, that the invitation was the thing she had been working toward. The acknowledgement, from the industry she had given 12 years to, that she had earned her place among its institutions. She talked about the engineered pause before the word silhouette, and the way it had landed, and the specific cost of that kind of wound because it was delivered so precisely. In the language of the professional world she had worked so hard to join. She talked about standing in a building full of beautiful things and feeling like the least beautiful thing in it. And then she said, "That was a lie the room was telling. Not the room as architecture, the room as it had been arranged for 61 years by people who had decided which version of beauty deserved to take up space." She said, "The problem was never any woman's body. The problem was always the room." She said, "This room is different now. Not perfect, not finished, but different. And different is the beginning of everything." The applause was the kind that starts in one area and spreads unevenly and then finds itself all at once, not manufactured, not the performed enthusiasm of people who are attending an event, but the sound of people responding to something that landed in the specific place they hadn't known they needed it to land. She stood in it for a moment and let it exist. She didn't rush past it. Damien was in the room. She had not announced his presence, and he had not called attention to it. He was standing near the back, in the civilian mode he was capable of when he chose to be, looking like nothing more specific than a man attending something his wife had organized. He was not the story today. He had understood that without being told, which was itself a kind of progress she did not take for granted. After the speech, after the crowd began to circulate again, and the staff moved through it doing their work, she found him near the side wall with 2 glasses of water because he had always understood that she needed water after speaking, even when she forgot to ask for it. He handed her one. "Well?" she said. He looked around the room. At the people in it, the specific alive quality of a space that was being used for the purpose it was built for. At the gown on the center display, the piece by the 24-year-old designer from 2 miles east, a structured ivory with unconventional seaming that moved beautifully, which had been photographed 17 times in the past 2 hours by people who had then asked about the designer's name and how to contact her studio. "That young woman's career just changed," he said. "That was the idea," Elena said. He looked at her. "I know." He paused. "I want you to know that what you built here, I understand that it's yours. Not in the legal sense, in the real sense. I understand the difference now." "Do you?" "I'm still learning it," he said, "but I understand what I'm learning." He held her gaze. "That's different from where I started." "Yes," she said. "It is." She drank the water. Around them, the afternoon continued. Conversation, movement, the occasional sound of a decision being made, a woman saying yes to something in one of the fitting rooms in a voice that carried the particular quality of someone choosing to take up space rather than apologize for needing it. It was not a perfect day. The vandalism was 3 weeks behind them, and the legal process around Carver was ongoing and would be for months, unfolding through channels that were not public and not simple. Damien's father had not called again. Elena did not know what Damien had said to him, and she had decided, at least for now, that not knowing was acceptable. That there were certain conversations between a man and his father that belonged to them, provided they did not arrive on her doorstep. She would revisit that decision. She kept most decisions revisable. The relationship between her and Damien was not fixed. It was the same relationship it had always been. 2 people who had chosen each other, who were imperfect in complementary and sometimes contradictory ways, who had learned something significant in the past 6 weeks about the difference between loving someone and respecting the space they needed to exist in. That knowledge was not a solution. It was a foundation. Building on it would require the same sustained daily effort that building anything real required. She was prepared for that. She had always been better at sustained effort than at dramatic gestures. Late in the afternoon, when the room had thinned to the people who were staying by choice rather than momentum, a woman came up to her, late 50s, wearing a coat that had been carefully maintained over many years, the kind of woman whose elegance was not about money, but about a long relationship with her own sense of what she deserved to wear. She had been in the room for 3 hours. Elena had noticed her twice, once near the main display, once in the fitting corridor, and had let her move at her own pace. The woman stopped in front of her and said, "I came to one of these places when I was 26, getting married. First time, ultimately not the last." She said it without particular weight, just fact. The woman who helped me made me feel like I was doing her a favor by leaving as quickly as possible. She looked around the room. I walked in here 3 hours ago and a young woman asked me what I was looking for and then actually listened to the answer and She stopped. Her jaw moved. I'm 62 years old, and it was the first time that happened to me in a room like this. Elena looked at her, held the look. I'm sorry it took this long, Elena said. Don't be sorry, the woman said. Just keep it open. She left shortly after. Elena watched her go and stood for a moment in the middle of the room that had once been the place where she had stood and been measured and found insufficient, and she took stock of what she felt, not triumph. Triumph was too light, too clean, and this day was neither light nor clean. It was heavy with the weight of everything it had cost. The 6 weeks, the marriage, the nights, the photographs on the storage room floor, the gowns cut on their hangers, the moment she had sat on the cold marble surrounded by images of herself and called her husband's number and waited. What she felt was closer to resolve. The specific feeling of someone who has survived something that was intended to stop them and has decided, fully and without reservation, to continue, not despite the cost, including it, taking it along as evidence of what she was capable of enduring and what she was capable of building afterward. She was 31 years old. She had a fashion house that was hers, a boutique that was becoming something the city hadn't had before, a marriage that was honest in ways it hadn't been a year ago. She had a long time ahead of her. She intended to use it. Jade appeared at her shoulder. Last stragglers are finishing up. Let them take their time. The crew wants to know if you're coming to the dinner Rosa organized. Tell them I'll be there in an hour. Jade nodded, started to move away, stopped, turned back. Elena, she said, for what it's worth. She paused. You were always supposed to be in that room. 6 weeks ago and today. You were always supposed to be exactly in this room. Elena looked at her. I know, she said, not as dismissal, as statement, the simple fact of something she had always known underneath the noise of everyone who had spent years suggesting otherwise. I've always known that, Jade smiled, left. The room emptied gradually. The staff moved through it with end-of-day efficiency, straightening and covering and closing with the ease of people who already knew the rhythms of the space. Damien had stepped out 20 minutes ago to take a call, returning twice to check on her and leaving again without asking anything. When the last staff member had finished and the building was quiet, Elena stood in the center of the main floor alone. The chandeliers were still lit. The new ones, warmer than what had hung here before, lower to the ceiling, positioned to distribute light evenly rather than spotlight from above. They threw the room in a gold that was forgiving and clear simultaneously, the light that did not ask anything of the people who stood beneath it. She breathed in. The room smelled like people, like the traces of perfume and coffee and a long afternoon, like a space that had been inhabited today in the way it was built to be inhabited. She breathed out. She reached up and turned off the chandeliers. The room fell into the ambient light of the city coming through the new windows. Enough to see by, softer than the chandeliers, the light of a building at rest between one day and the next. She stood in it for a moment. Just a moment. Just Elena Vale, in a room she had rebuilt, in a city that now knew her name, in the quiet after everything. Then she picked up her bag and her coat and walked out the front door, pulling it shut behind her. The lock clicked. The street was cold and the city was doing what it always did, moving, indifferent, already occupied with its next thing. She stood on the sidewalk where 6 weeks ago there had been glass and the particular sharp sound of destruction, and she looked up at the building's facade with its new windows and the small understated sign above the entrance, her name in clean letters above the name that had been there for 61 years. Damien's car was at the curb. He was leaning against it with his hands in his pockets in the cold, waiting, not on his phone, not looking elsewhere, just there, waiting for her. She walked toward him. He opened the door. She got in. He walked around and got in beside her, and the car pulled into traffic, and the building receded in the mirror and then turned with the street and was gone. And they moved together through the city in the particular silence that no longer needed to be explained between them. After 3 blocks, she said, I want to go to dinner. Rosa's dinner? No, just us. Somewhere without people we know. He thought for a moment. There's a place off the eastern corridor. Quiet. They don't know my face there. That one, she said. He gave the driver the address. They rode the rest of the way in the dark, the city lights moving across the windows in intervals, and she thought about the woman in the carefully maintained coat who had come to a place like this at 26 and been made to feel like an imposition and had come back at 62 and been listened to. And she thought about what it meant to keep something open, to decide that a door you build should remain a door for everyone who needs it. She would keep it open. That was the commitment she had made, not in the speech but before it, in the 6 weeks of work, in the decision to rebuild instead of retreat. She would keep it open not because it was easy or because there was nothing left that could try to close it, but because closing it would mean agreeing finally with the long accumulated voice that had spent 31 years suggesting she didn't belong. She had never agreed. She was not going to start now. The car stopped outside a restaurant on a quiet street, and Damien got out first and came around, and she got out into the cold air, and he did not take her arm, but he stood close, and they walked toward the door together, and it opened, and the warmth of the room came out to meet them. They went in.